I'm Ralph Tyko with the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and I have the honor of introducing Bill Kashatus. Bill, tell us about your new podcast, Philadelphia Baseball, Past, Present, and Personal.
We're going to each week explore the rich history of Philadelphia's baseball and the personalities who have shaped that history, as well as those who continue to influence the current game. My guests will include former major league players, owners, journalists, and authors who've written books on Connie Mack's A's, the Phillies, and the old Negro teams, as well as those who were involved in the region's amateur baseball scene. So that's, in a nutshell, what I hope to do.
Hey, and in that nutshell, you just became a podcaster. Congratulations and welcome to the network. Let's start out, Bill, if we could learn a little bit about you and your background and your passion and what brought you to this all.
I had always loved history in school, and I majored in that discipline in college and then earned 2 graduate degrees in it, a master's from Brown University and a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. And I initially started working in my field, my dissertation topic, which was early American history, and I found out very quickly that the small coterie of scholars who reviewed these works were rather proprietary and rather petty in their criticisms. So as a release, really, I went back to my childhood passion, which was baseball, and started writing baseball history. And
all right, Bill, you grew up in Philadelphia?
Yep.
Or right outside Philly?
Correct.
And tell me about your first game. Your first experience must have been Shive Park?
It was. It was in 1964. My uncle, a former Major League Baseball player himself for the Cleveland Indians, took me to that game, and I immediately fell in love with the Phillies and their rookie, a third baseman by the name of Richie Allen. And
don't call me Dick, right?
Correct. One of the things that struck me, and I think it's very similar to many people who love the game. You walk into Shive Park, which was built in 1909, and at that period of time, 1964, was in the middle of urban blight. You had to watch your car if you expected to have 4 tires on it. But you walk into this stadium in the middle of the city, and you go up the runway, and all of a sudden, you come onto this beautiful green field in the middle of the city, and there was the peculiar odor of cigarette smoke, stale beer, popcorn.
Some peanuts and popcorn, maybe?
Exactly, and that just turned me on. I was sold by the environment, the atmosphere, and then, of course, watching Richie Allen hit a home run to win a game against the St. Louis Cardinals. That was it. I was sold.
Well, I'm an inner city person myself, and my first experience was with the Polo Grounds. And for me as a little kid, I was 4 or 5, it was the expanse of the grass, the green grass in the middle of an urban environment. And I don't know, I really don't know Philadelphia as well as I do New York. Did the green really impress you? Did the grass impress you as a kid more than almost anything about it?
That was the first thing. Now, of course, the Polo Grounds, that was a much broader expanse. It was you had Coogan's Bluff looking over it, and the idiosyncratic dimensions of that park. Shive Park was a little bit more contained. You had the right center field. You had a Longines clock there. It was open in back. You could see the parking lot. The dimensions were nowhere near as deep as they were in the Polo Grounds, so it was a little bit more contained. And I think having that greenery in such a contained space is what really fascinated me.
Right. I talk to a lot of people, and they remember their boyhood in just that way, especially city people. Do you consider yourself an urban person or a suburban person?
Well, now I consider myself a suburban person because I live in Chester County, which is about 18 miles to the northwest of Philadelphia. But having been grown up in Philadelphia in the northeast part of the city, spending really the first 17 years of my life there, that never leaves you. And I have lived in Washington, D.C., Indiana. I've lived in Providence, Rhode Island, many, many places. I lived in London for about a year, and no place has the same type of sentimental pull that Philadelphia has for me. And I knew I was going to come back here. It's home, and always will be. And a big part of that is because of the Philadelphia Phillies.
Wow. We both have the same passion, and I'm so happy you're joining the network based on your passion and your love for baseball. And the idea that you picked Dick Williams, and I'll go against his wishes by calling him that, for your first book. Am I correct? That was your first work.
No, actually, my first book was on Pete Gray, the one-armed wonder of the 1945 St. Louis Browns. That was my very first book, and he was. I
didn't know that. I thought you started with, and I almost assumed you would have started with a Philadelphia hero, but Pete Gray, incredibly fascinating, hated by his co-ball players. Am I correct? His teammates very much disliked.
Correct. Absolutely, he was. And that book, I hope, by the time Pete died in 2002, I hope it restored some integrity to his career, because the way he had been considered during the time he was playing was as a circus freak, someone who was at Gator Tracks and for the DeWitt brothers who owned the St. Louis Browns, and he was being used, he was being exploited, and he even felt that way. And I tried to say in that book that this was an individual who had become a hero for veterans returning home from World War II, the battlefield, as amputees, because he gave them a new lease on life. He showed them that despite the loss of a limb, you could succeed in whatever profession that you chose. And Ralph, let me add that book was a prototype for all the other baseball books I have written, and now we're talking about, I guess, 12, 13 of them. And what I mean by the prototype is I have a PhD in history, in American history, and I write in context, the historical context. So, for example, when I wrote about Pete Gray, I was really writing about World War II America and what was going on the home front. And Gray became the focal point of that. And since that time, I've written about the modern civil rights movement. The focal point was the relationship between Jackie Robinson and Roy Campanella. I've written about Indian assimilation at the turn of the 19th century. The focal point of that was Chief Bender, the pitcher, the Hall of Fame pitcher for the Philadelphia Athletics. And I've written about racism and integration in the city of Philadelphia, and the focal point of those books has been my first hero, Dick Allen.
So you really are a history writer still.
Yes, absolutely. And had it not been for the petty coterie of quote-unquote scholars in history that destroyed, actually just ravaged my works. When I first started out, I was writing on Quakers and the American Revolution and in the early Republic. Had it not been for those historians, and I really have to thank them for it, I probably would not have written baseball history. But yes, I'm a historian first, and baseball has simply become the vehicle with which I write history.
Well, people say baseball is a microcosm of life, and others say that life is a microcosm of baseball. So it's...
You are so right, Ralph. You are spot on with that statement. I think Ken Burns has shown that in his magnificent documentary on Philadelphia baseball. In fact, he even said when he first came out with that film that he could have written a separate documentary on baseball and civil rights, which then he really kind of tried to do with his subsequent documentary on Jackie Robinson. But you were so right. To understand, as Jacques Barzon said, if you want to understand the heart and soul of America, you have to understand baseball, because that describes it all. Many people say, well, that's no longer the national pastime. Arguably, it's basketball in urban areas. It's football in many rural parts of the country. But really, there is no sport like baseball that speaks to American values of fair play, sportsmanship, periodic corruption,
right.
our sense of who we are as a people and the American national character. Baseball says it all.
Bill, you were talking about civil rights, and I have to interrupt to pay homage to Rachel Robinson, who last week was inducted into the Hall of Fame. And you have to know, my listening audience, how without Rachel Robinson, by Jackie's side, Jackie Robinson would not have achieved what he achieved. There was no way that he, the sensitive Jackie Robinson, who took it on and had no other outlet but Rachel to talk to. She was the first wife allowed to travel with the Dodgers in 1947. Mr. Rickey arranged that so that Jackie would have someone to talk to. Just had to interrupt and tell everybody what a monumental experience it was for baseball and for the Hall of Fame to recognize what she did. That's really great. They've made a lot of mistakes in the past, and Richie Allen may be one of them. We can get into his whether or not he should be in the Hall of Fame, and I'm going to ask Bill's opinion on that. But just a moment to thank Rachel Robinson for making it all possible on the same level that Branch Rickey and her husband Jackie made it possible. There you go. Bill, talk about Richie Allen a little bit and his Hall of Fame credentials.
Richie Allen came into baseball in 1960. He came out of a small integrated rural town in western Pennsylvania called Wampum. He had really never known race prejudice. I might add that if you were a child who was coming up, born during the Great Depression and coming up in that kind of environment, on the tails of the Depression, poverty is a great equalizer. So it really doesn't matter what your skin color is. Everybody is pretty much operating on the same social and economic plane. When he comes into the Phillies organization, and he does very well in Single A and Double A, then in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, where he meets his future wife, and he is sent down to Little Rock, Arkansas to play for the Travelers in 1963. Now, Little Rock in 1963 was an extremely segregated town, and that club had not been integrated. And Allen felt that the Phillies were using him to make a statement about integration in the South. And he was treated terribly. The N-word was bantered about, which, frankly, he became used to, even in his early years in Philadelphia, because Philadelphia was, at that time in the 60s, one of the most segregated cities in the North, and had a segregated baseball tradition. But he survived. He did more than survive. And he was promoted to the Phillies in 1963 at the end of the season, and then became the starting third baseman in 1964. He won Rookie of the Year honors for basically leading the offense in a foiled pennant run. The team was up by 6.5 games with 12 left to play, and they lost 10 straight to finish in second, blowing the pennant. Cardinals went on that year.
Kind of argued Gene Mock's genius. Was he really a genius?
I don't think so. I think Mock, this was really his first major league managerial position. He got scared. He panicked. Instead of using his pitching staff appropriately, he pitched bunting and short some days with less than 2 days rest. It was back-to-back.
Right.
And he panicked. And it was a young team. Very few, with the exception of Bunting, had any experience in definitely in postseason play or even with a pennant race. So, very young team, and it was their fate. But having said that, Allen emerged as an up-and-coming superstar. The next year, things went south very quickly. In July of 1965, he and one of his friends on the team, Johnny Callison, was joking around with a popular white veteran by the name of Frank Thomas, who, by the way, played for the New York Mets. And
right. They called him the Mule.
The Mule, right. The Mule, Donkey, was what he was more popularly known as inside the clubhouse. And they were joking around with me, took exception to it, and he said something to Allen, comparing him to Malcolm X, which you just didn't do to Richie Allen at that period of time, because he did not respect Malcolm X's separatist approach to civil rights. So Allen went up to him, and Thomas took a bat and just about broke it across Allen's back. There was a fight, and Thomas, an aging veteran, was released. I mean, the Phillies certainly were not going to release or trade their up-and-coming franchise player. And Allen was ordered not to say anything to the press, whereas Thomas, who was hosting a radio show in the late mornings, went on the airwaves the next day and just excoriated Allen. And that's where it all started. Allen was treated disdainfully.
Just painted in a light that wasn't really Richie Allen.
Absolutely correct. And he eventually was treated with so much abuse that when he played the outfield, he had to wear a batting helmet because fans were pelting him with batteries, coins, beer, whatever. And, Ralph, if you can imagine this most schizophrenic situation, Richie Allen would go up to the plate, he'd hit a 2-3-run homer, everyone would give him a standing ovation, and then he'd go out in the field, and if he made an error, then the N-word would start. And this is what just, I could not relate with this. I mean, I was a young kid. I was 6, 7, 8 years old, and I'd go to the ballpark, and this abusive language was what was being bannered about. Now, I'm a Quaker, and went to Quaker schools, and Quakers have been leaders in not only the abolition of slavery but in the civil rights movement in this country. And I could not fathom what they were doing to this man. There was one occasion where there was a fan in the stand who held up his little boy. The kid couldn't have been more than 3 years old, and he was pointing to Allen, yelling the N-word, and teaching his son how to boo. Rules in our family was you don't boo anybody. You cheer on the home team. Yeah, this was culture shock to me. I could not understand what was going on, especially for a player of his caliber. And Allen begged for a trade. He begged for a trade. But the Carpenter family would not do it because their fortunes in that club were bound up with Richie Allen. So what did Allen do? In a period of time when free agency didn't exist, he did the only thing you could do. He showed up late for games, or not at all. He missed flights, and all this was his way of saying, "Get me out of here." And Bill James, the great sabermetrician, basically did Richie Allen a huge disservice because he said Richie Allen blew apart every team he ever played on by manipulating racism. That is not true. Allen was a victim of racism, not a manipulator of it. And if you go to and ask the people in St. Louis, in Los Angeles, in Chicago, where he was beloved, by the way, they will tell you he did nothing but mentor his teammates. He never, ever criticized the fans, never made any gestures, never went into the stands. He respected the fans. His offense spoke for itself, and yet James made this really unconscionable remark that I believe the writers bought into and prevented Richie Allen, later Dick Allen, from getting into the Hall of Fame when the writers were voting on his candidacy. He never got more than 18.9% of the vote when the writers were voting on his candidacy. And in 2014, when the Veterans Committee considered his candidacy for the first time, he lost by one vote. And that vote, that would have been Bob Watson's vote. Bob Watson was a huge Allen supporter, but Watson had a family issue he had to attend to. He could not attend the vote. A proxy was named for him. That proxy, who shall go nameless, but we know who he is, that proxy did not vote the way Watson wanted him to vote. He voted his own beliefs, and that's the one vote Dick Allen needed to get into the Hall of Fame. Now, curiously, Allen was on the golden era, the old golden era ballot. Curiously, this last summer, the Hall of Fame decided to change the rules. They're going to break that. They broke up that golden era ballot into two committees. One, the Golden Days Committee, which will not vote until December of 2020, and that considered candidates from 1955 to 1969, and then the Modern Days, which considered candidates from 1970 to 1987. Now, we all know Allen played from 64 to 77. And that Modern Days Committee is going to vote this December. Allen's name is not on that ballot. When those of us who were concerned about this, because they felt it would have only been fair, he lost by one vote last time, to try to get him back on that ballot as soon as possible, we called the Hall of Fame and asked Jeff Idelson why his name's not on the ballot. And he told us that Allen put up his big numbers in the 60s. That's not true. If you look at his career, Allen won a major award in both those time periods. Rookie of the Year in 1964. MVP of the American League in 1972. He had 3 All-Star
the White
games.
Sox.
Yeah. 3 All-Star game appearances.
Let me give you a little anecdote. I spoke once to fellow by the name of Lamar Johnson, who was a terrific Major League ball player, really good hitter, lasted about 10 years and was Richie Allen, Dick Allen's teammate on those White Sox teams. And he said there are two things to remember about Richie Allen or Dick Allen. I get confused. But one of them was that he hit the ball harder. The ball came off Richie Allen's bat faster than any other Major League player he ever saw. That's
correct.
Lamar Johnson talking. And the most important thing to remember, he was the best teammate, according to Johnson, that he ever had. He was the best teammate that anybody ever had, his words. So that dispels a lot of things that you hear about Richie Allen. I didn't know about the Thomas instance. Whoa, that and I often wondered why a guy like Frank Thomas, with all that 30 home run a year power, went from team to team. He was, I think he came up with the Pirates. I know he was with the Braves, the Phillies, the Mets. That probably had a lot to do with it. Do you think?
Well, I don't want to pass judgment on what Thomas's career was like before or after Philadelphia. I know that he was struggling when he was with Philadelphia. He broke his thumb in the last weeks of the 1964 season, and in fact he tried to play. He tore the cast off, but he couldn't, and he was helping. His bat was helping the Phillies stay in the pennant race before he broke that thumb. The kicker is that Thomas and Allen knew each other from Western Pennsylvania. They grew up around each other, and I might add that all has been forgiven between the two of them, and they remain friends to this day. But the point is that at the time, Thomas was upset. Was rightfully upset about his release, and it wasn't handled properly by the Phillies, and he could not discipline himself to keep his mouth shut. And that basically
but he couldn't discipline himself to not hit Allen with the bat.
Absolutely.
The bat.
There's no excuse. There's no excuse for that. There's no excuse for that. None whatsoever. A lot of this has to get placed squarely on his shoulders. The other half has to do with the poor judgment of the Phillies organization at that period of time. Going back to what I was saying.
Let me ask you one thing about Wampum, PA. Was there another famous? Was it Musial that was from there? Or?
No, Musial and the Griffeys were from Donora, Pennsylvania.
Okay. That's
terribly far. Yeah, he's not too terribly far. But very quickly,
same thought process. I thought I just confused it. A lot of great athletes we're talking about, right?
Oh yeah.
From a little area in Pennsylvania, right there, and surprisingly too, that they. I wouldn't be surprised if they produced a lot of football players, but Philadelphia is like New York. You don't get to play. If you grown up in Florida or California, you get to play basically 12 months a year. To play and to succeed, like people like Hebner and those guys grow up with very little time to play baseball. Added kudos for those guys.
Yeah, Pennsylvania is a much bigger, and Philadelphia is a much bigger football town than it is baseball. This place has always been known for football. If you look at Pennsylvania, we've got 6 Hall of Fame quarterbacks that come out of this state, and not one of them from the eastern part. It's all from central Pennsylvania west. But we do have a baseball tradition, ironically, that dates to before World War II, we've had, 6 Hall of Famers come out of a small 150-mile area called the Anthracite Coal Region in northeastern Pennsylvania. And those Hall of Famers include Christy Mathewson, Ed Walsh, Stan Kowaleski, Huey Jennings. I mean, there's some impressive people that came out of the coal region for baseball, but by and large, Pennsylvania is a football state.
Right. I think Jim Leland came from that area of the world as well.
Yeah, he's the western part of the state. He still lives there.
Right. Let's talk about Jim Bunning. He passed away in the last few weeks. Just off, if we were to play the name game, and I just said Jim Bunning, what would you say?
Well, that's I don't know if that's a fair question to me, because Howie Bedell is the person I say, and that's the immediate name that comes to me, because Bunning and Bedell were inextricably related in the Phillies organization. A lot of other people would say the perfect game he threw against the Mets in Father's Day of 1964, but no. And I mentioned Howie Bedell, who's still around, because Bedell was the individual that released Jim Bunning, who he had played with in Philadelphia. They were teammates. He released him from the Phillies organization as a minor league manager in the Phillies system, and Bunning left baseball after that and became a U.S. congressman and then a senator. So in a weird way, it was the best thing that ever happened to him. But Howie's story is a little bit more profound in the sense that he went on from the Phillies to become director of player development for the Kansas City Royals and then the Cincinnati Reds. And this is a guy who has 3 rings to his name, 1 from the Phillies, 1 from the Royals, and 1 from the Reds, for building the teams that went on to win world championships. So that's a bit of a...
Howie Bedell was a prospect with the Braves coming up.
Correct. Very good. And do you know what he has gone down in baseball history for?
Right. I think you're starting to recognize me, Bill, as an idiot non-savant.
He has gone down. Well, I wouldn't say that. I'm very impressed with your knowledge, because you're a New York guy, right?
Right. And a baseball card collector. I still see his rookie card in my mind, Howie Bedell. And I was the Topps rep in the 80s and 90s, so I got to meet a lot of guys involved in player development and scouting. I got to meet Howie Bedell at one time. Terrific guy, as a matter of fact. Go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, Howie is known historically for being the man who ended Don Drysdale's scoreless inning streak in 1968.
Was that there was something with Drysdale? Maybe you can help me. A controversial call on a record that he had, and Dick Dietz was involved. Do you have a recollection?
I might be wrong about this, but again, I think it was the scoreless inning streak, and Dietz knocked in a run, and I'm not sure if there was. I don't know the particulars of it, but I do relate it to that scoreless inning streak. And the decision was eventually ruled in Drysdale's favor, and I think it happened just a week before Howie broke that record, his scoreless inning streak record, because the streak remained intact, and then Howie destroyed it with a sacrifice fly and scored, I guess it was Tony Taylor from third base, and that was it.
Hey, isn't it fun to look back? I can't remember where I left my keys, but I could remember things that went on 100 years ago.
Ralph, you talked about the death of Jim Bunning. This year, I don't know what's in the water here in Philadelphia. We have lost a lot of very dear people. Dallas Green, the manager of the 1980 World Series, Phillies, passed earlier this year. We lost Ruben Amaro, who was his right-hand man and coached on that team with him. And Ruben Jr., his son, was the Philadelphia Phillies general manager for many years. And then most recently, we lost someone who was near and dear to me, Darren Dalton of the 1993 Philadelphia Phillies. Darren died of glioblastoma, brain cancer, although he fought a valiant battle for 4 years and outlived life expectancy with that disease by almost 2 years.
I'm reminded of Tug McGraw, who died of cancer as well.
Tug McGraw was the best friend I had from the Phillies, and I miss him. There's not a day that goes by that I don't think of him. He was everything I think that is great about the game of baseball. He loved kids. He loved people, and never passed up an opportunity to promote the game of baseball.
Bill, he was my favorite all-time Met. I was devastated when he was traded to the Phillies for John Stearns, the dude. And he broke the spirit of the Met. That, along with the Seaver trade, of course, helped break the spirit of the Mets, and certainly my spirit as a fan. He was also from Vallejo, California, was Tug McGraw. And I went to Vallejo Junior College before it became Solano College with one of his brothers. I don't know if it was the brother that was a catcher, and this is 50 years ago. I have great memories of Tug McGraw, and
it probably was.
Very sad.
Probably
sorry
was
for your loss, because people think people that cover baseball and involved with it, well, they interview people, they cover the stats, they do stories, this and that. We become involved. We become friends with people. You take a loss. It's like anything else. It's a business relationship, but it's a friendship that you develop as well. And I'm sorry. Sorry for Darren Dalton. Sorry for a lot of guys. Mortality is not our friend. Let's put it that way.
Right. Ralph, who was the player that you've been closest to over the years?
I'll tell you that from doing Tops, I was the Tops representative, and I would sign players to contracts with Tops to obligate players, obligate Tops, so when and if they reached the big leagues, and I would interact with them in the lowest minor league situation when they first come into baseball. And I'm covering Fresno, the Fresno Giants, and the person who I was there to see was Robbie Thompson.
Mm-hmm.
And I introduced myself to Robbie, and I told him I was from Tops, and that I had a contract for him to sign that would pay him money. Now we gave him a $5 signing bonus. But more importantly, when and if they made the big leagues, we used their picture used their image on a card. We paid them money. They get residuals. They get this and that. And he looks at me and he says, when and if I make the big leagues, It's not when and if, it's when I make the big leagues. And he glared at me. And I turned that interaction around to a warm friendship at the time. Just and an unbelievable respect for what makes up a player's constitution.
Wow.
What makes some players with the same ability make it big and others not make it big. And it's all in their head. And I got that from him, and I followed him his whole career incredibly closely, and really identified with what he said. And I passed that thinking down when I raised my kid. It's what you think you're going to accomplish. You have to believe it before anybody else believes it. You believe it yourself, and you can make it happen. And you got to realize this guy was like my size. I'm a little skinny, 5'10" guy, and he wasn't skinny. He was wiry, but he didn't look at the time like a future major leaguer. And I just happened to make that offhanded remark, and it pissed him off enough that I knew that this guy was going to make it. So you asked me that question. That's just a rambling answer to that. I can't tell you how much respect I have for that man. And it turns out, as a human being, he was every bit as great as he was as a player. Tragically, family members were killed, leaving twin daughters, young daughters, that he and his wife raised, and it's just a tremendous guy. Does that answer your question, Bill?
Oh, very, very well, and I think the lesson about having confidence in yourself is true for anything you want to do in life. So that was really good, really good statement for him to make. Tell me about the baseball cards. When you were a kid, do you remember the first pack of baseball cards you opened up?
No, but I do remember the first baseball card I ever saw. It was the year they put the little picture, and it wasn't even a Topps card. I think it was Fleer or Donruss. They put a picture of the television, and the image of the player was inside a television. I think it was 1954, 52, somewhere. It could have been 52. It must have been 55, maybe, I'm guessing. But the card was Solly Hemus.
Solly Hemus, the Cardinals.
Cardinal, later coached the first the original Mets, Solly Hemus. And so I remember that, and what a learning experience from cards. Not only math, how to do ERAs, how to do batting averages, but just learning, putting records into perspective. You see on the back of the card, there'll be, a person's 9-year career. You see the ups and downs. You see the amount of games played. I studied these cards from. I never opened a school book. I'd be, what are you doing, Ralph? I'm studying. Studying baseball cards.
So you weren't one of those irresponsible kids who took them and took the clothespins and clothespinned them to the spokes of your bicycle tires to make those crazy sounds? Oh,
worse
yet,
I'd lose them flipping cards. I was the worst flipper in the neighborhood. And I can remember collecting like half the set, and then going out one day and just getting into a flipping contest with Stanley Weiss, the guy who took most of my baseball cards, or, as you say, putting them on your bicycle to make the bicycles sound, and no respect respect for them whatsoever in terms of keeping them pristine and what have you. But they were made to be played with and used, and looking back, I'm not sorry. What the hell? I've collected cards over the years to replace them. But sure wish I had the ones that I opened up, and the thrill of looking through a pack of cards. Got it, need it, got it,
right.
need it. That thing. Well, yeah, it's wonderful. And, of course, later on, I got the greatest fantasy job in the world. I wrote Seiberger a letter, who was the guru of all of this, and he ran Topps. And I read a book called Baseball Flipping Card Thing. It was in the 70s. It was given to me by a woman named Margaret Nearing. And she said it will change my life, give me humor to baseball, combine that. And indeed it did, but not for those reasons. There was a preface in the book written by Seiberger that explained that in the old days, Topps would scout players on their way up and determine who was going to make it, sign those players, and ignore those who weren't going to make it in their estimation. Well, Maury Wills ended up making it, much to Topps' dismay, because they hadn't signed him, and when he came up, he was bitter that they snubbed him in the minors, and Maury Wills never had a Topps card until late in his career. So,
wow.
What Mr. Berger said in that preface is that now they sign everybody in organized ball to a contract, and those who make it, those who don't, but everybody is signed. And I thought to myself, somebody's got to do that job. Go out and sign players. Doesn't take a baseball scout anymore. It just takes someone who's good with people, who's an administrator, who can talk and schmooze, and has a passion for the game. So when I go to these different teams, I recognize the players that I grew up watching are coaches and managers in the minors, and I react with everybody, and it was great. So I was given the opportunity to spend summers in employ of Topps. They paid all my expenses in a per diem, and I drove around the Northwest and California, up as far as Washington in the Northwest League, California League. One year I did the Midwest League, and it was a kick in the ass. That's the best thing I can tell you. You mentioned the Griffeys. I signed Ken Griffey Jr. when he was 17 to his Topps contract in Bellingham, and we had to send it to his dad so he could co-sign because the kid wasn't old enough to sign for himself. And I got to interact with him and Will Clark and countless players that went on to the big leagues and whose company I enjoyed in the very, very low minors before it all takes hold.
Mm-hmm.
Players change.
You mentioned
game changes. For them as they make the majors. So I got to interact with players, and when they were still human beings and not in some gated community, never relating to the fans.
You mentioned when you would get a pack of baseball cards, you'd say, got it, need it, got it, need it.
Well, if I had the card, I'm looking through the cards, thumbing through them, and determining in my head, got it, need it.
Right.
So I'd have duplicates to trade. I'd flip the duplicates first. That's how I remember doing it. when I lost them, I'd dip into the cards that I thought, well, I'll get this guy again. And gambling is a downhill route. Let's put it that way. Learned that early on.
But I was one of those kids that just tore open those packs and wanted to get my heroes. You know, do I have Mike Schmidt? Do I have, you know, is he in this pack? Is Richie Allen in this pack? Let me take a wild guess. Your hero, the Mick, was it Mickey Mantle?
No, it wasn't.
It
was
wasn't.
Willie.
It was Willie. Yeah, you were. You were either a Mays or Mantle guy. Well, how did that come about? You were a New York Giants fan. You couldn't have been.
Well, New York Giants, Willie was New York Giants. I was lucky enough to be taken to the Polo Grounds in 1951 by my grandfather.
Okay.
He took me there first, and it was before Willie was called up. And he explained the configuration of the team. Bobby Thompson was playing center, and Monty Irvin was playing first, and Lockman was in left. And then he took me to the other parks in 51. He took me to Ebbets Field, and he pointed out in Ebbets Field that his sister, my great aunt Sonny, lived across the street on Bedford Avenue in that apartment there, he pointed. Wow. And then he took me to Yankee Stadium, and he pointed to Joe DiMaggio, and he said, this is his last year. He's retiring. But I want you to remember, and he put his finger on my chest, look at that man. You saw Joe DiMaggio play.
Wow.
Then he took me back to the Polo Grounds, and Willie had been called up, and as a result, all the other guys got switched around. Lockman went to first, Irvin went to left, Thompson went to third, and again, 4.5, pointing these out. Dark playing short, Stanky playing second, and we'd go many games because he was semi-retired, basically retired, and he needed an escape from his loving wife for 50 years. So he'd get up, Rose, it's a nice day, make sandwiches, we're going to the baseball game. And if it was Saturday, there was Ladies' Day, and she'd get to go along.
Wow.
They had Ladies' Day in those days where you get in, I don't know if it was half price or free, a lady got to go. And things have changed. They don't have many half price days and very few double headers. That's the big change for me.
Tell me, did you ever get a chance to meet Willie Mays?
Oh, absolutely. Got a chance to meet him once. Surly guy, but the biggest hands I've ever seen in my life. Unbelievable. Got to shake hands with him. It was cool. He was my hero, but not my favorite player. You know, my favorite players were the guys like Alvin Dark, Robbie Thompson later, that type of things. Because I could never identify with a Mays or a Mantle or an Aaron, but I could identify with the guy struggling a little bit, you know, with average abilities, playing over his head because, again, what we talked about, it's in any profession, it's all up in your mind. It's all up in your brain. Can you make up for lack of skills by doing the little things like hitting to right, you know, that kind of thing? That's how I worship. I worship the underachievers, the overachievers.
That's fascinating distinction that you just made. I'm working on between the players who were your heroes and those who are your favorites. You know, I'm working on a book on Rocky Colavito right now. And
don't ever knock the Rock.
That's right. That's Gordon Kovaldick's book title, which was the last book that was written about him, really. I mean, there's Curse of Rocky Colavito, but Rocky doesn't really like the book or count it as one of his favorites. But Rocky Colavito told me, I'm not a hero to anybody. I would like to be a favorite player, but not a hero. And I said, are you crazy? I mean, there are a lot of, you had a fan club there in Cleveland in the late 50s and then in the 60s. And he said, a hero to me is someone like a firefighter or a soldier, someone who saves lives or fights for democracy. He said, I can be a favorite player, but I never want to be anyone's hero. And he says, besides, the people who adopt you as heroes don't really know you. Your parents should be your heroes. Your big brother should be your hero, as it was for him. And I thought that was, in a way, that was kind of sad. But now I get it, that you explained that distinction to me. And I thank you. I really do appreciate that. It's a great insight.
Yeah. Well, Rocky Colavito was a New Yorker. So
that's right.
You gotta expect things from New Yorkers that supersede a lot of, good insight from those people. We got it. Hey, Bill, this is a great introduction to your show. You're on your way. You got it, man. We've identified your passion and your love for the game and your abilities to put the game into perspective using history. Just got to ask you, because the book that I read growing up was Willie's Time by Charles Einstein, and it seems to me that his writings, not having read you yet, were very much along the same lines of yours. He wrote about Willie Mays, but not really about Willie Mays. It was more about the times that he grew up in. His chapters were based on the presidents. The first chapter was Herbert Hoover, who was president when Willie was a youth growing up in Alabama. And he explained the times around Willie, the situation racially and in every other way. And I think your books do the same. Am I right?
Yes, that's a very creative way of going about a topic, but rather than following really an entire life, I like to find a snapshot, and usually it revolves around the player's best year. So yeah, but that's a good comparison. I've got to get that book.
Please do. Also, give the audience your introduction. How will you open your podcast?
Yo, Philly, how you's doing tonight? And then I go. That's hopefully going to be my trademark greeting.
Beautiful. Ian, we talked about our mutual friend, Ian Kashatus. He's got a trademark greeting. My baby dolls. So, welcome back, that type of thing. Welcome back to Genesis. And I'm thrilled to have you. Like I say, this is it's going to be wonderful. Same time next week, you're going to record your first podcast. Let's not give any secrets away, but I can tell you it's going to be terrific. And you'll be back next week. My pleasure to do this. Thank you, Bill. I'm honored to have you at the network, Comfortably Zoned Radio Network.
Okay.
Bill.
Yep.
All right. Let's say goodbye to the audience. How about that?
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much, Ralph. I appreciate it.
Okay. Be well, sir, and look forward to it next week. Everybody, tune in.